Hello, my name is Maria Lakic, and in my presentation I'm going to be speaking about whether I'd rather have Pelagius or Augustine as my pastor, and why. As the foundation of my argument, I think that I need to explain what I believe the righteous role of a pastor is first. In my opinion, a pastor is supposed to be a spiritual leader for members of a church community, and in this sense, that is referring to a Christian community, and their role should be to lead the people, to advise them, to teach them, to care for them, and then to provide counsel for all. I would argue that both Augustine and Pelagius took on this role and completed it successfully, but they did so in very different manners. Their beliefs and their arguments had different emphases, and this is what separates the two figures. After learning about both of them, I came to the conclusion that I'd rather have Pelagius as my pastor, and I will explain my reasoning in the following slides. Before I begin, here's a graphic that includes two quotes from these two prominent figures and gives a little overview of their main beliefs. To the left, Augustine is depicted saying, "O God, command what you would and grant what thou dost command." On the right, Pelagius says, "If God is just, righteous, and holy, and God commands of the creature to do something, certainly that creature must have the power and the moral ability within himself to perform it." These two quotes are very good representations of what I'm to explain, and they sum up what we've learned about these two theologists very well. Pelagius on God and humanity. The Pelagian view is very well known for emphasizing both God and humanity and not prioritizing one nor the other. He believed that both had to work in concord for a person to be able to achieve salvation. In my first bullet point, I have written that Pelagius was an advocate of free will. By this, I mean that Pelagius claimed that not just dependence on God earns salvation for one, but there are other factors that play into it. Those being strict morals, free human acts, and divine aid. As a pastor, Pelagius taught his audience that strict morals and physical human acts, including prayers, fasting, and other things of that sort, were what attains salvation for a person, not just dependence on God, because then they would turn into very lazy people in a moral sense. And this is where Pelagius and Augustine differ very greatly in this exact view. A very valid point that Pelagius uses to justify this thinking is that if God holds people responsible for their sins, that would not be fair unless people had the power to stop sinning. This backs up his view on free will, and that free will and human acts play a role in all good works. And of course, there is a component of divine help aiding in that manner, but it is not overpowering, which was very important for Pelagius's audience to understand while he was teaching them. Some people thought that this was Pelagius being too simple, too ignorant, because he was ignoring the role of God in the lives of people. But I do not think that this was the case. I think that he saw a line between reason and scripture. He was very realistic, and I believe that it was a very healthy way of living and a very good outlook on life. I truly don't see his view as a downgrading of the role of Christ and God. To me, it seems more of just a very approachable spiritual lifestyle. To conclude my slide on Pelagius, I would like to mention one of my favorite quotes of his that I came across while reading, and that is that God helps those who help themselves. It's truly a very insightful quote, and there is a lot of background that goes with it. He is basically saying that God will give his grace to those who work for it, those who deserve it, and those who respect God, and in return they'll be rewarded with eternal salvation. And that's what he means by saying that God helps those who help them. Now I will be talking about Augustine, who had contrasting views than Pelagius, but they had the same end goals. Originally, Augustine was not born a Christian. Later in his life, he received a vision which told him to pick up a Bible and start reading it, so he did so. Afterwards, he soon got baptized because he was moved by the writings of the Bible, and he converted to Christianity. The reading said that this was him becoming a product of his own culture. Augustine had completed what St. Paul had started, and that's why he's considered one of the most significant Christian thinkers after St. Paul. He is also the reason why Western theology is different from Eastern traditions, which did not pick up his teachings and his theologies, and then that is also why people refer to Augustine as the father of the Western Church. In choosing my preference of Pelagius as a pastor rather than Augustine, I am not implying that Augustine is wrong and Pelagius is right. I am only saying that because I prefer Pelagius's emphasis more than Augustine's, but they both focused on the same main idea. I would say that the starting point or the foundation of Augustine's teachings as a pastor was that God was the most supreme and that everything else depended upon him, including the achievement of salvation. This thought was evidence for his claim that states that humans are saved by God's grace alone, having nothing to do with individual works and acts of human beings. This is why Eastern theology differs so much from Western theology, because the Easterners deemed Augustine's thinkings as too extreme, while the Westerners took on his preachings and theologies. And it is also the main point where Augustine and Pelagius differ. I believe that this claim of his is kind of dramatic, and indeed Augustine was known to use vivid imagery to capture the drama and conflict associated with achieving salvation, while he was teaching that God acts with love to save humanity, and that humans don't have to do anything else to earn the grace. This made many people morally lazy, which I also mentioned while speaking about Pelagius, which was not a good thing. Two of the teachings that Augustine is most well known for are those of predestination and original sin. On predestination, he said that only a few people were saved, and God knew who was saved and who wasn't. This was definitely not something that his audience wanted to hear. The God that they previously knew would not act like this towards humanity. While Pelagius thought that God helps those who help themselves, Augustine said that God helps those who cannot help themselves, meaning that no human act can grant them salvation. Righteously so, people became skeptical of Augustine. Predestination is kind of rooted in his view of original sin, which says that everyone's born sinful and that there's nothing that they can really do about it other than wait for God's love to grant them salvation.